A racist landlord evicted this elderly black woman from a luxury villa, humiliating her in front of everyone. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. What she did next didn't just expose their racism, it shocked the entire world. Stay tuned for the story you won't forget. The soft glow of the afternoon sun bathed the sprawling luxury villa in golden light. Nestled on a secluded hillside overlooking crystal-clear waters, it was the perfect retreat for Martha Turner, a 72-year-old retired teacher who had spent decades shaping young minds in her community. For Martha, this vacation wasn't just a getaway. It was a celebration. She had saved for years to afford this moment. After all the sacrifices she made as a single mother raising 2 children while working tirelessly, she finally had the chance to indulge in a little luxury. Her children, now successful in their own careers, had encouraged her to treat herself. They wanted her to experience something special, a reward for a lifetime of selflessness. As she arrived at the villa, Martha could hardly contain her joy. The place was breathtaking. White pillars framed the entrance, and the scent of fresh jasmine wafted through the air. "This is everything I've ever dreamed of," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes as she stepped through the grand doors for the first time. The villa's staff greeted her, but not all with warmth. Some exchanged skeptical glances, their expressions cold and dismissive. Martha tried to ignore it. She told herself she was imagining things, that they'd warm up once they got to know her. It started small. A staff member, a young man in a pressed uniform, accidentally ignored her requests for basic services like fresh towels and assistance with her luggage. A receptionist avoided eye contact as Martha politely asked questions about amenities. Each interaction left a sour taste in her mouth, but she didn't let it ruin her mood. Then came the whispered conversations she overheard. "She doesn't look like the kind of person who belongs here," one voice said. "Are we sure she can afford this place?" another muttered. Martha felt the sting of their words, but she held her head high. She was used to fighting battles. She had faced racism throughout her life. Endless assumptions and prejudices. She thought she had grown numb to it. But here, in a place where she should have felt safe and celebrated, it hit her differently. The turning point came on the 3rd day of her stay. Martha was lounging by the infinity pool, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and sipping her iced tea, when the villa's landlord arrived. A tall, imposing man with an air of self-importance, he approached her with a cold smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "There's been a mistake. You need to leave immediately." Martha blinked, her heart sinking. "I beg your pardon," she replied, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. "This villa is reserved for our premier guests," he said, his eyes scanning her with thinly veiled disdain. "We've reviewed your booking, and it appears you don't meet the requirements for this property." Martha's hands trembled as she set her glass down. "I've paid for this villa in full," she said firmly, pulling out her reservation confirmation. "This is my home for the week, and I won't be leaving." But the landlord wasn't interested in reason. "Security!" he barked, signaling 2 guards to approach. "Escort her off the premises." As the guards loomed over her, Martha felt a familiar wave of anger and sadness. She pleaded with the landlord to check the booking again, but he waved her off. "We reserve the right to refuse service," he said smugly, as if that settled the matter. Within minutes, she was surrounded by other guests and staff, all watching the spectacle unfold. Some whispered in disapproval, but no one stepped forward to defend her. As Martha gathered her belongings, she overheard a woman sneer, "This isn't the kind of place for people like her." Martha looked around, her face a mix of pain and determination. She wanted to scream, to demand justice right then and there, but she took a deep breath, held her head high, and walked away with dignity. That night, Martha sat alone in a small roadside cafe, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't crying out of humiliation. She was crying out of anger. The injustice she had endured wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who had ever been told they didn't belong. She opened her phone and started typing, detailing every moment of the ordeal in a social media post. She hesitated, wondering if anyone would care, But then she pressed post. Little did she know, the world was about to take notice. Martha's hands trembled as she set her phone down on the small cafe table, unsure of what would happen next. Her post detailed everything: the smug landlord, the racist remarks, the public humiliation, and how she had been evicted despite paying in full. She ended it with a heartfelt plea. This isn't just about me. This is about fighting the discrimination that so many of us face every day. I won't stay silent anymore. She didn't expect much to come of it. After all, she was just an elderly woman sharing her story. But as she sipped her coffee and stared at the screen, notifications began to flood in. Within hours, Martha's post had gone viral. Thousands of people commented, expressing outrage and support. "This is despicable. How dare they treat you like that?" one comment read. "Enough is enough. We're with you, Ms. Turner," said another. Journalists began reaching out to her, asking for interviews. Influencers with massive followings reposted her story, amplifying her voice to millions. One comment stood out to her, though. It read, "They think they can treat you this way because they don't know your worth. Let's show them." The very next day, news crews showed up at the villa. Guests and staff were caught off guard as reporters demanded answers about Martha's eviction. The landlord, visibly flustered, dismissed them with vague excuses. "She didn't meet the standards of our clientele," he stammered. "It was a simple misunderstanding." But the damage was done. Social media erupted with fury. People began calling for boycotts of the villa and leaving one-star reviews on every platform they could find. Videos of Martha calmly recounting her story on national television were shared millions of times, further exposing the landlord's actions. One particular clip stood out. Martha, sitting gracefully in a chair, said with quiet determination, "I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for anyone who's ever been told they don't belong because of the color of their skin." Support for Martha poured in from all corners of the world. Civil rights groups reached out, offering legal assistance. Celebrities shared her story, calling out racism in the travel and hospitality industry. Donations flooded into an online fundraiser, started by her granddaughter, meant to support Martha's legal battle and future endeavors. But what moved Martha the most were the personal messages she received. One young woman wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to stand up to my boss when he discriminated against me." A father shared, "My daughter watched your video and asked, 'Why do people act like this?' It opened a conversation we've never had before." Martha realized her story had become bigger than her own experience. It was sparking conversations, inspiring others to speak up, and holding people accountable. Just as she began to feel the momentum building, Martha received a call that would change everything. On the other end of the line was Joan Peters, a high-powered attorney and advocate for racial equality. "Ms. Turner," Joan began, her voice steady but filled with purpose, "your story has struck a chord with people everywhere. I believe we have the opportunity to not only hold this landlord accountable, but to set a legal precedent that could protect others from similar treatment. I want to represent you." Martha was taken aback. She had never seen herself as someone who could make a difference on such a large scale. "Are you sure this is worth the fight?" she asked hesitantly. Joan replied firmly, "It's not just worth it, it's necessary. Together we can do more than seek justice for you. We can make sure no one else goes through this again." The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Martha and Joan gathered evidence, from her reservation receipts to the security footage showing her being escorted out. Joan contacted former guests of the villa, some of whom shared their own accounts of subtle racism they had experienced there. Meanwhile, the landlord's attempts to control the damage were failing spectacularly. Public outrage had grown so intense that several of the villa's sponsors and investors announced they were pulling their support. Martha, once unsure of her strength, found herself emboldened by the support she received. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt powerful. The night before the first court hearing, Martha posted another message. "I was humiliated, but I'm not broken. Tomorrow I'll stand in front of the court, not just for myself, but for everyone who's been treated unfairly because of racism. It's time to make a change. The post garnered millions of likes and shares overnight. People from all over the world vowed to stand by her, and the hashtag Justice for Martha began trending. Martha went to bed that night with a sense of calm determination. She knew her story wasn't just about fighting back. It was about inspiring others to believe in their worth and demand the respect they deserved. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Journalists lined the back of the room, their cameras clicking as soon as Martha Turner entered, flanked by her attorney, Joan Peters. Martha wore a simple yet elegant navy dress and carried herself with quiet dignity. Despite the nerves buzzing in her chest, she walked with her head held high. Seated at the defense table was the villa's landlord, Paul Kingston, his once confident demeanor replaced with a pale, uneasy expression. The backlash from Martha's story had already begun to dismantle his reputation, but this hearing could determine the future of his business and his name. Joan Peters stood to deliver her opening statement, her voice clear and firm. Your Honor, today we bring forward a case of blatant discrimination. My client, Miss Turner, was evicted from a luxury villa, despite paying in full and meeting all booking requirements. The reason for her eviction wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was racism. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Joan continued, This case isn't just about Miss Turner. It's about sending a message that no one, regardless of their race, should ever be treated as though they don't belong. The defense attorney attempted to downplay the incident, arguing that the eviction was due to a clerical error. Paul Kingston avoided making eye contact with anyone as his lawyer spoke, visibly uncomfortable under the scrutiny. Joan presented her evidence meticulously, starting with Martha's reservation confirmation. It clearly showed she had booked the villa, paid the full amount, and met every requirement. Next, she played security footage from the villa. The video showed Kingston approaching Martha at the pool, followed by the humiliating scene of her being escorted out. The court watched as Martha's calm pleas were dismissed, and the landlord's cold demeanor became undeniable. Then came the most damning piece of evidence, an email exchange between Kingston and his staff. In one message, Kingston wrote, "She doesn't fit the image we want for our property. Handle it discreetly." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Martha's supporters, sitting in the gallery, exchanged looks of outrage and disbelief. Joan stood tall, her voice cutting through the noise. This email alone demonstrates that my client was targeted, not for any legitimate reason, but because of her race. When it was time for Martha to testify, she felt a wave of nerves, but also an overwhelming sense of purpose. She recounted the events with clarity and emotion, describing how she had been excited for a peaceful vacation, only to be humiliated and treated as though she didn't belong. Looking directly at the judge, she said, "I've spent my whole life fighting to prove my worth in a world that often tries to tell people like me that we're less than. That day I was reminded of every door that's been slammed in my face, every opportunity denied simply because of the color of my skin, but I won't be silenced anymore. This isn't just about me, it's about justice." Her words brought some members of the gallery to tears. Even the judge seemed moved, nodding solemnly as Martha finished her testimony. The defense attempted to counter with claims that Kingston had acted in the best interest of his business. But their arguments fell flat, especially when another former guest, a black couple, came forward to testify about their own experience of subtle discrimination at the villa. "Every time we asked for service, it felt like we were being ignored," the husband said. "At first we thought we were imagining it, but now I see it wasn't just us." The judge listened intently, his expression growing more serious as the evidence mounted against Kingston. While the trial unfolded, the world continued to rally behind Martha. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse each day, holding signs with messages like, "End racism in hospitality," and "We stand with Martha." Social media remained ablaze with updates about the case. Celebrities voiced their support, and organizations began calling for broader reforms in the travel industry. The hashtag Justice for Martha had grown into a full-blown movement. After days of arguments, the judge finally delivered his verdict. The courtroom was silent as he spoke. "It is clear to this court that the actions taken against Ms. Turner were not only unjustified, but rooted in prejudice. This kind of behavior has no place in our society. The judge ruled in Martha's favor, ordering Paul Kingston to pay significant damages for emotional distress and discrimination. Additionally, the court required Kingston's villa to undergo mandatory diversity training and implement policies to ensure fair treatment of all guests moving forward. Martha's supporters erupted into applause, and she felt tears streaming down her face as she grasped Joan's hand. Justice had been served. In the weeks following the trial, Kingston's villa faced a mass exodus of customers and sponsors. Several properties he owned were sold to cover the damages, and his name became synonymous with disgrace. Meanwhile, Martha's story continued to inspire change. Advocacy groups began working with lawmakers to introduce anti-discrimination measures in the hospitality industry, and her case became a landmark example of holding businesses accountable for racism. In the months following her landmark victory, Martha Turner's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. What began as a personal fight for justice had blossomed into a national movement, shining a light on racism in the hospitality industry and beyond. When Martha returned to her hometown, she was greeted like a hero. Hundreds of supporters gathered at the community center to celebrate her victory. Banners hung overhead with words like, "Welcome home, Martha," and "Thank you for fighting for all of us." One by one, people approached her to share their gratitude. "You gave us hope," a young woman said, tears in her eyes. "Because of you, I finally feel like I can stand up for myself." An older man shook her hand firmly. "You're a symbol of strength for all of us," he said. "You reminded the world that we won't stay silent in the face of injustice." Martha was overwhelmed by the love and support, but she couldn't shake one thought. Her work wasn't finished. Martha began partnering with advocacy groups to address systemic racism in the travel and hospitality industries. She worked closely with Joan Peters to draft proposals for new anti-discrimination laws that would ensure no one else would face the kind of treatment she had endured. Her story opened doors to opportunities she never dreamed of. She was invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing her experience and calling for change. "I may be just one woman," she said during a speech at a civil rights summit, "but together we are a force to be reckoned with. Racism thrives in silence. Speak up and watch the world change." Her words resonated deeply, inspiring thousands to take action in their own lives. Martha's case sent shockwaves through the travel industry. Major companies began implementing diversity training programs, updating their policies, and pledging to hold their employees accountable for discriminatory behavior. One hotel chain even reached out to Martha personally, asking her to consult on their new inclusivity initiatives. "We've learned from your story, Ms. Turner," the CEO said during their meeting. "We want to make sure our guests feel welcome, every single one of them." For the first time, Martha felt like her pain had led to meaningful progress. Ironically, the villa that had once been a symbol of Martha's humiliation became a beacon of her triumph. After Paul Kingston was forced to sell the property, it was purchased by a black entrepreneur who transformed it into a welcoming retreat center. The new owner reached out to Martha with an offer that left her speechless. The villa would be renamed Turner Haven in her honor. When Martha visited the newly renovated property, she couldn't help but smile. The grand entrance now bore her name, and the staff greeted her with warmth and respect. "This is how it should have been from the start," she said quietly. Martha's children and grandchildren were her greatest source of pride throughout the journey. Her granddaughter, who had started the online fundraiser, often told her, "You've shown me what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." During a family dinner one evening, her son raised his glass. "To Mom," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You've taught us all that dignity and strength can change the world. We couldn't be prouder of you." Tears filled Martha's eyes as she clinked glasses with her family. For her, their love and support were the greatest victories of all. As Martha's story continued to inspire change, she decided to write a book detailing her journey. Titled, "More Than a Villa: My Fight Against Racism and Injustice," it became a bestseller, reaching readers around the world. In the book's final chapter, she wrote, "I didn't set out to change the world. I only wanted to defend my dignity. But through this journey, I learned that standing up for myself meant standing up for countless others. We all have the power to make a difference. Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. In a quiet moment years later, Martha stood on the balcony of Turner Haven, gazing out at the same breathtaking view that had once been tainted by pain. But now it was a place of peace and triumph. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her fight had been difficult, but it had been worth every step. Martha knew her story would live on, not just as a tale of injustice, but as a powerful reminder of what one person's courage could accomplish. The hashtag Justice for Martha had long outlasted the initial court case, evolving into a rallying cry for those fighting against discrimination. Across social media, people shared their own experiences of injustice, uniting under the banner Martha had inadvertently created. Her courage had ignited a global conversation, forcing businesses, lawmakers, and individuals to confront uncomfortable truths. One by one, stories emerged of companies revising their policies, employees receiving diversity training, and communities holding forums to discuss racism and inclusion. Martha Turner taught us that one voice can inspire millions, said a renowned activist during an international human rights conference. Her story reminds us that courage is contagious. Martha was especially moved by how her story impacted young people. Students across the country invited her to speak at their schools, eager to learn from her wisdom. One day after a speech at a high school, a 16-year-old girl approached her shyly. "Ms. Turner, I've always been afraid to speak up when people treat me unfairly," she said. "But you've shown me that I don't have to stay quiet. Thank you for giving me the courage to stand tall." Martha knelt to meet the girl's gaze, her voice soft but firm. "Never let anyone make you feel small, sweetheart. You deserve to take up space in this world. Remember that." Martha's contributions didn't go unnoticed. Civil rights organizations, community leaders, and even national governments recognized her as a trailblazer. She received awards for her advocacy, including the National Medal of Justice, presented to her at a ceremony attended by dignitaries from across the country. As she stood on stage to accept the honor, she addressed the audience with humility and strength. "I didn't fight this battle alone," she said. "Every step of the way I was lifted by the love and support of people who believed in me. This award isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who has ever faced injustice and said, 'Enough.'" Her words brought the audience to their feet, their applause echoing through the hall. Despite the fame and accolades, Martha remained grounded. She spent her days gardening, baking with her grandchildren, and reading on her porch at Turner Haven. But even in her quiet moments, she never stopped using her voice. Her book, More Than a Villa, became required reading in schools and was translated into multiple languages. A documentary about her life, Dignity Defended, won international awards, cementing her legacy as a symbol of resilience. In her later years, Martha took steps to ensure her impact would outlive her. She established the Turner Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to combating systemic racism and providing scholarships to underprivileged students. The foundation's first recipients were announced at a special event held at Turner Haven. One of the recipients, a young man named Marcus, delivered an emotional speech. "Because of Ms. Turner, I'm going to college," he said, his voice trembling. "She believed in us when the world didn't. I promised to make her proud." Tears filled Martha's eyes as she listened. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew the future was in good hands. In her final years, Martha often reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought back to the day she was evicted from the villa, the humiliation she had felt, and the strength she had found within herself. She smiled softly, gazing out at the horizon. "What they tried to take from me," she thought, "became the very thing that made me stronger." Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever fought for dignity, justice, and the right to belong. On her 80th birthday, Martha sat surrounded by her family and closest friends. Laughter filled the air, and the table overflowed with food and love. As the sun set, her granddaughter asked, Grandma, if you could go back and change what happened at the villa, would you? Martha paused, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. No, sweetheart, she said with a gentle smile. Sometimes life takes something from you to show you what you're truly capable of. That day wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. As the candles on her birthday cake flickered in the evening breeze, Martha closed her eyes and made a wish. It wasn't for herself, but for the world she had helped to change, a world where everyone, regardless of their race, could feel like they belonged.